Hello, everyone, and thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast, where we talk about everything related to language learning. My name is Clayton, also known as George Pig, and I manage the community here at Refold. Today, our guest is Alex, also known as Skypon. He's the admin of the Italian server, a contractor for Refold, and a Romance language polyglot. All right, and Alex, welcome.
Thank you.
So, do you want to go ahead and introduce yourself, who you are, what your background is with languages, and what you do in the Refold community or what you have done?
Sure. My name's Alex. I'm 21, though by the time this podcast videos come out, I'm probably already 22. My background with languages, I grew up in a pretty multicultural household. So I've always been around different languages, but I wasn't raised speaking another language natively besides English. So there was always this attraction to learn more about other cultures and languages. I would, I'd say one of my earlier memories. Well, yeah, I think I went down the rabbit hole of YouTube polyglots, and I was like, it's incredible how these people speak 13 languages, and I wanted to be that. So I would download apps, really not knowing what I was doing. I was probably 13 at the time, and I would try to learn a few phrases. There was this one app, I don't even remember what it was called. It had really bad UI, and it was one of those apps where you would have to pay to unlock all the phrases, but you get like 20 basic phrases, like "May I have some water?" "Hello, what is your name?" For like a bunch of different languages, though. And that was really cool to me because I growing up in the U.S., you don't even though I'm from Southern California, which is quite multicultural, there are some ethnicities, some languages that just really aren't represented here, and the world's so diverse that just necessarily there's going to be there's going to be less homogenous distribution of languages. So, anyways, just seeing on this app like, oh, Luxembourgish, I wonder what the hell that sounds like. And then I'd have all these fantasies of learning different languages and not really getting very far. But actually, no. Now I'm remembering probably the first language I tried to learn was Korean, because in middle school I had a lot of Korean friends, and they would speak Korean to each other, and I was like, I want to learn Korean. So I learned Hangul, and that didn't take that long. And then I was trying to really get in there, and I remember I had this piece of paper where I just write down words, and it just didn't amount to much. So those were the early days. And then I took Japanese in high school because my school offered it, and I was like, that's cool. At that time, I was less interested in Japanese culture, even though it had been present in my life a lot already. A couple of my close friends growing up were Japanese. I did kendo when I was younger. So it was cool to finally actually learn a language in a classroom setting, because that's the furthest I had gotten. Because, okay, you have a textbook. Even if you get lazy, the school, the class goes on. So you necessarily just learn something. And I was really, really into Japanese at the time because it was so different and whatnot. But yeah, so after Japanese, or in high school, I learned about AJAT and MAT, which is Japan, and then that culminated into and then it integrated into the Refold community. But before Refold, I hadn't really been a part of any specific language learning community. When I was learning, I know we'll get to this later, but when I was learning Italian, which is the first language that I learned through immersion, that I learned from zero, that was very solitary in that I couldn't find many Italian learners who were doing the same thing I was. So I kind of was like, okay, I'm just going to block out all connection with the English language and learner circles, and just watch native content, kind of very hardcore, but it worked out. But now my opinions are different. So I don't know if that answered all those questions that you asked me, but that's a start.
Okay, well, actually, it was a good introduction, but there are still some questions I want to
Oh
ask.
yeah,
So,
sure.
um, you mentioned that you grew up around multiple languages, and like
Yeah.
it's visible in your background. You have an
Yeah.
Icelandic flag, for example.
Mhm.
So you're sort of a heritage speaker of Icelandic and
In Spanish.
Spanish, right?
Yeah. It's more complicated than that. My grandma is Mexican,
Okay.
but her ancestors are from Spain originally. They were Spanish Jews that got kicked out, and then they immigrated to Mexico, and then they
Okay.
retained their Jewish customs. But interestingly, my grandma, she's very she's not Jewish. I mean, religiously, she doesn't practice Judaism. She's Seventh Day Adventist, I think. She's very religious
Okay.
though. But yeah, so my mom also speaks sort of Mexican Spanish,
Okay.
but I it's interesting you bring that up because my grandma would always speak it to me, and I apparently I asked this to my mom recently. I'm like, when did I start speaking? Like because recently my cousin came over with her baby, and it was so weird to see. I haven't seen a baby in so long, and she was a little over. She was like 14 months, and she hadn't started speaking yet. And she's like, "Oh, you were pretty late to speak because you were learning Spanish." I was like, "You just forgot to tell me that I was learning Spanish as a kid." She's like, "Oh yeah, you were originally bilingual." I have no recollection of that, obviously, but yeah. So I kind of early on, unfortunately, I didn't like Spanish much because my grandma was kind of a little overbearing. So I saw the Spanish language as tied to her. My mom never spoke it around me. Of course, she's a native. Both my parents are non-native speakers. My mom grew up here, but my dad is from Iceland. He moved to the U.S. When he was 12. He had not really speaking any English. He was in Canada when he was 10. His parents kind of dropped him off there with a family friend who lived there who was Icelandic. But the kids didn't speak Icelandic, and my dad had to do school, and it was kind of a mess. But when they did immigrate when he was 12, they went to Seattle, and he slowly learned English, and now he doesn't have an accent. And it's funny because I've gotten my dad, since I'm home now, I've gotten him to speak more Icelandic with me because I want to take advantage of this opportunity. But really, he decided, oh, I don't need to teach him because he'll just learn Spanish and French, and I'll touch on French in a second. So he didn't speak it to me, but now he's speaking it more. But in the past, I would just forget that he's Icelandic because he sounds completely American. I mean, maybe if he's really tired or drunk or something, he'll mix his V's and W's, but he's pretty indistinguishable. But when he's in Iceland, he looks and sounds Icelandic, but when he's in the U.S., he looks and sounds American. So it's interesting.
I totally understand. Half my family is Canadian,
Oh,
and
okay.
quite a few of them moved to the States when they were teenagers.
Uh-huh.
Um, and I've got uncles and a sister, and so I've got a whole bunch of extended family who are Canadian. And for a lot of them, they just sound American until they
Yeah.
don't. They might accidentally use a Canadian vowel in an otherwise American sounding sentence. I can think of one relative who visited and he deletes the schwa in the word veteran. So he says veteran.
Uh-huh.
Or I have one uncle who is from Canada, stays in Canada, occasionally comes to visit. And I can recall that being one of my first times realizing, oh, they're definitely not American. He was telling me about his goat pill. I listened to his story about his goat pill, and at the end of it, I'm still confused. I'm like, but you're here in the States. You didn't bring your goat with you. And my Canadian relatives looked at me like I was stupid and said his gout pill. He's talking about his gout pill for his toe.
Oh,
Because of the difference in vowels. And it's very easy to forget
oh,
that your relatives who were raised abroad and immigrated to the States are not American after they've been there for 20
totally.
years, not
Yeah.
originally American. So it's
Yeah.
always a shock.
And my dad definitely speaks English better than Icelandic. But one thing that I am happy about, of course, I've lectured both my parents at length on immersion-based methodology, and I've shared my ideas on language with them. To my mom, that just goes right over her head. But with my dad, I mean, he's like, this makes a lot of sense. That's how I learned English, because you can't surround yourself really with Icelanders. There's not many ethnic enclaves like that. Though in Seattle there are lots of Scandinavians, but And at
I think
university,
there's like Gimli in Canada. There's like a
uh,
little bitty tiny enclave somewhere in Canada called
probably, yeah,
Gimli.
probably.
Yeah.
But I mean, he was thrown into the
Icelandic would be a great language to do immersion in, actually. They have one of the highest number of authors per capita of any
yes,
language.
that's true. I think the
They're very
statistic,
literate.
yeah, is 1 in 10 people write a book or become authors. Yeah, it's very literate. The literary roots run deep, of course. You can read the sagas without too much effort. I mean, you have to be like college educated, and it's a bit of a stretch, but just that capability is, I think, pretty unique because the language hasn't changed much compared to the other Scandinavian languages. Norwegian and Swedish have modernized a lot more, and Icelandic is kind of, since it's been isolated for so long, has really kept kind of that old flavor. So yeah, it's interesting.
Yeah, I think they also underwent a linguistic revival in like the 1700s.
Mm.
I think they purged a lot of Danish loanwords. So I've actually heard that it's easier to understand stuff from 1000 AD than it is to understand stuff from like 1500
Yeah,
because of
interesting.
the Danish influence that was later purged. Little unknown
Yeah.
fact or little known fact about
That is cool.
Icelandic.
Danish, though, is taught in schools, but it's like Spanish kind of in the US where,
Mhm.
not everyone's going to take it seriously, but everyone has some sort of basic understanding of it, along with English, of course. But yeah.
Now, going to your languages, you learned Japanese traditionally, and I think you even maybe went to Japan back when you were still a trad build learner.
Yeah. Yeah.
And
So
then,
that was a school
what?
trip. Yeah.
It was a school trip. How long were you there?
Not very long. It was less than 2 weeks, maybe 10 days. So we didn't
Okay,
even fully adjust to the time difference.
gotcha. And then I met you originally because you were a contractor for Refold. You
Yes.
had learned a whole bunch of Italian, and you were one
Mhm.
of the sort of the lead non-natives helping with the Italian deck, which finally
Mhm.
got released a
Yes.
month or two
Recently.
ago after like
Mhm.
a year in limbo.
Yes. It was a
Um,
long process.
and that was sort of your first time actually like really learning a language the Refold way.
Mhm.
Um, and do you want to talk a little bit about that? So, like you mentioned, like now you're a mod on the Italian server. It's
Mhm.
still pretty quiet there, not a whole bunch of learners.
Fortunately.
But you went from sort of AJATing Italian, not having any
Mhm.
social things outside
Yeah.
of Italian. All you did was Italian, and now you sort of like you're social. You're a part of the Refold community. You're a
Yeah.
mod. Uh,
Mhm.
you have done work for Refold, and you've also started to kind of you've got the dabble-itis. You sort
Yeah.
of have been
Yes, I
hopping
have.
around. You've kind of unfulfilled after getting good at Italian.
Exactly. That's a good
So
way to
do
put
you
it.
want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, there's lots to talk about. Okay, so the difference between traditional learning and refold learning, I don't see, though I learned Japanese traditionally, I was less traditional than other people because I discovered AJAT. Though I didn't fully get it, I hadn't read the full table of contents. It somehow didn't click until later, until after I'd graduated and decided, no, I actually want to do something with my time. I really want to get fluent in a language. So then I went ahead and read it. But even though I was learning Japanese through textbooks, um, I was on this one Discord server that was like a learner server, but there were high level learners, so I would kind of just lurk there and read the messages in the Japanese only channel. So I had some exposure to the real language, and it is really interesting how Japanese textbooks, especially since it's a different language, since there are certain words and grammar patterns that are difficult to translate, maybe even impossible to translate into English directly. They don't have an equivalent. They kind of just sweep it under the rug. They ignore it as if it wasn't there. But then, of course, you listen to real Japanese or you read real Japanese, and you encounter these words, and then people blame themselves and all this stuff. But Yeah, learning. I wouldn't recommend how again, my ideas have changed. Like I said, I wouldn't really recommend going about learning a language like I did with Italian. I just graduated high school. I just came back from a trip from Italy. That was my first time ever going, and I really liked it. And I really there was this strong intrinsic motivation because there was nothing external, no external factors were really influencing my motivation. I don't know any Italians. It's really actually difficult to find Italians on the west coast of North America. I go to school in Canada, and still there's like none there. The Italian department is one professor who's from like some random place in the center of Italy, and there's like no natives. So it's like it was just it started as an experiment. It was like, okay, let's see if these principles that I learned from this one blog work, and I had a hunch that they would work because really to fully subscribe to that mentality, you have to. It's like an act of faith. You have to really believe in, okay, this is going to work. And I think one of the main phrases or if you will, kind of ideas that helped me get through it was this idea of see and do, not wait and see. So instead of, okay, let's see if I mess around a little, let's see how good I get. It was more like, okay, no, I'm going to put down this amount of time for this summer. I really didn't have much to do because I didn't have like assigned reading or any assignments because I was going to a new school. I was going to university. So I just decided, let's just see what happens if I make almost all of my time watching Italian. And I didn't even do any sort of grammar study. I just kind of jumped in. And yeah, it was pretty. It's hard for me to talk about this because this was already 4 years ago. So I've forgotten a lot of these things. I think once we get to a certain point in a language, our brain forgets what it was like to be in those beginner stages.
You've been at Italian for 4 years.
Yeah. But I would
Okay.
say the first 2 years were the really intensive periods, and then I took a whole year break, and then this last year I've been, 1 month on, 1 month off. Recently, got the opportunity rather, to use my Italian, which that hadn't really happened in the past. There were a few odd experiences, and it didn't all go super well, but not because I was necessarily tripping up on my words. One of them was actually in Iceland. I guess I'll just tell this really quick. This is a short version. I don't want to get too distracted because I'm already getting off topic, but my family and I went to this Italian restaurant. The waiter was Italian, and I was very excited to use Italian because this was like at the tail end of this really intensive period that I was learning Italian. And yeah, I started speaking Italian to him, and it didn't click immediately, but I could tell he was like not wanting to speak Italian. And then I was asking him in Italian, I'm like, oh, why'd you decide to come to Iceland? And then the first thing he asked me, he's like, oh, do you want me to respond in Italian or English? I'm like, Italian. And then he just goes on this long rant about how his life growing up was hell, and he's from some small village in the north of Italy, and he lived with his grandma who is super. She wouldn't like let him have friends over, and anyways, he was just saying all this stuff, and I was like, I was like, oh, I'm sorry, and I kind of didn't know what to say. So it was an odd situation, and there wasn't really any like any times of like, oh, I made a friend in college who's Italian and who speaks it, and then when we hang out we can just speak it. It wasn't like that. It was like I would have to seek out people, and I wasn't really into the whole well, I guess I could have done italki, but in my mind I kind of had this idea, no, I want to be pure. I have to talk to natives who don't treat me as a learner, and I just want to try to infiltrate the ranks of Italian natives. So I didn't want to like lurk on Discord voice chats, and it was too much for me. I'm still shy, and that's why this method works well for me. But yeah, there was a lot more that I wanted to say from the earlier question. But
You sort of had a big moment recently. I think some of your family
yes.
might have hosted an Italian family,
Mhm.
and you had some opportunities to actually
Exactly.
sort of output with friends, not a random service work or not
Yeah,
hunting people down in the streets. So how did that go? Sort of
sure.
after 4 years
That
of
went really
just
well.
going all Italian.
That went really well. So, I guess I haven't touched on this, but I have family in France because my uncle married a French woman. They had two kids, and through them, we were pretty close to that side of the family, even though I guess not necessarily blood related to everyone. But so we go to France very often. So French has always been a presence. So, anyways, I'm learning French now, but I took a break from French, yeah, this month, kind of in the middle of this month, I guess the 15th or so, around there. And my cousin, my mom's cousin, so I don't know what that makes me to him, but they're hosting
I think that
an
makes
Italian
you a
community.
cousin as well.
It makes a cousin. Okay. So my
I
cousin
think that's how
also.
it goes.
Okay. I always get confused with these things. Yeah, they hosted these people. I'm still not clear on how they met. The father was, so it's a family of, they have a daughter, these husband and wife, and she's more or less my age. She's 19. Um, but I think the father was related to, was going to become a pastor, but then he quit the church and he left the church, and then he moved to the US somehow. I'm still kind of foggy on the specifics, but anyways, I had this opportunity to speak with them, and of course I was quite a little nervous in the beginning because I really haven't practiced much output. Not even just spoken. It's like I haven't like written to many people, and I think the problem is because I actually prefer speaking just in general. So and since I don't know any people IRL, it's hard. So okay, but it was pretty good. It was kind of mentally taxing because it was like 6-7 hours of speaking. I mean, not directly, and there was English mixed in because my cousins, my mom's cousins' sons, they're native Spanish speakers, but they don't really speak Italian, of course. So like it would be like me and her having a conversation, and then we would speak in English to them for a while and whatnot. But I think I already kind of knew that one of my blind spots was small talk, but I did a lot better than I thought. Um, yeah, it was a really positive experience. I think afterwards, I think it really warmed me up. It showed that okay, I am capable of actually speaking the language pretty comfortably. I mean, I did take like 2.5 days of pretty intensive immersion before just to prepare me, and that was like the right amount of time to prepare. But I think after they left, I was like, man, I wish I had more people to speak with because it's weird. It's like, okay, for 2 years you're really intensive just watching things, and then it's not really a part of your life, and then just one day these people plop into your life, and then you're only speaking this language. So it's a little odd. I would like to go back to Italy
Has
because
that
yeah, for that
So
reason.
going back to Italy would be awesome, but
Yeah, cool.
um, you know, right now you're in the States, then you go to school in Canada, so
Hmm.
trips to Italy are probably not going to be frequent or very long. Have you ever thought about doing something like not italki, but like one of the language exchanges, like Hello Talk or something? Have you
Yeah.
ever considered doing that?
Mhm. Mm. So recently, I more or less recently, about two months or so ago, I got Tandem, and that app's quite good. If if you find the right people, a lot of people don't take it seriously. There's this whole thing with flirting. Luckily, I haven't. There hasn't been too much of that in my experience. But yeah, I crosstalk for me was a huge revelation. And for people who don't know what that is, that's basically where um, you have a native speaker of your target language, and they're speaking to you in their native language, which is your target language, and vice versa. So you're speaking English to them. This is granted they're learning English or already at a high level of English and are just helping you out. Um, Crosstalk has been really great for me. I didn't touch on this, but I've kind of moved around all the different Romance languages except Portuguese. So I went back not that long ago and did Spanish for 3 months, and then I was like, okay, I feel like I'm at a decent level because really once you speak one Romance language, the other ones become very accessible. And then it was French, and then now I'm trying to further it. But also I picked up some Catalan, and doing crosstalk with that language has been really great because as an experiment, I'm trying to distance myself from the written language as much as possible and really just hone in on my listening. And it's been fun. Even almost day one, I was able to crosstalk. It was still pretty mentally taxing. There were still some holes in my vocab, but I could follow like a conversation. I could have a conversation. I haven't tried it for Italian yet, because I'd rather, well, I would want to speak Italian. I'd probably start with voice messages or something, or just texting. But yeah, that's definitely something I see myself doing in the future. And then maybe
You
even
know,
working with the teacher to work on some specifics, probably.
and I assume most of the Catalan speakers are from Spain.
Yeah,
Okay.
no, I haven't met any outside of Spain. Different parts of Spain.
Yeah, there's a very obscure dialect of Catalan spoken in Sardinia, if you're
Yes,
not
I've
aware.
heard of it. Yeah.
And I think there are some recordings on YouTube of people speaking it, but they have a very thick Sardinian influence. You can tell that it's sort of not their main language anymore. But that's really cool. I talked about this in the last episode. The language policy of Spain has been very good to its regional languages, all said and done. Catalan and Basque and Galician. These languages are in very good positions compared to some of the regional languages in, like, say, France. Yeah.
Definitely.
All
It's too bad.
And in addition to sort of becoming a romance polyglot, sort of collecting them all, you've recently expressed interest, I think, in Czech and Hungarian. So do you want to talk about those? So you sort of have like a wide net. You've done a bit of Japanese, you've done a bit of Korean, you've taken the romance languages pretty far, and now you've started sort of, experimenting with these Central and Eastern European languages. What's that like?
It's very different, and that's kind of the point. That's what I'm looking for. I think I almost wish that I think people tend to think highly of, oh yeah, you speak all the different romance languages. That's cool. I mean, originally I wanted to speak one, maybe two, and not touch any other. But how things turned out, I ended up wanting for more or less practical reasons to learn other ones. It's like, okay, my mom's a native Spanish speaker. Catalan has always sounded cool to me. I might even want to spend some time in Spain. I mean, my mom and I are, I haven't mentioned this. My mom and I are working on getting our Spanish citizenship through this heritage, because the Spanish government and Portuguese government were offering citizenship for the people they wronged back in the late 1400s. So
1492, I think.
Yeah. Oh my God, I totally forgot the question. Sorry.
The question was, how has it been going from
I remember.
a romance language to some of these other languages? Because like you mentioned, once you learn one romance language, you kind of get them free. Not really, but kind of. A lot of the grammar is
like
similar.
A month or two. It's 1 to 3 months of immersion, and then you more or less get it. It's funny because I tried French right after Italian. Well, first going to France, of course, I didn't go to France over COVID. That was the first time I hadn't gone to France for a summer. So going to France and not knowing any Italian, then going to France and knowing Italian, I was like, whoa, I understand a lot more than I thought. The vocab is very similar between those two. But with Spanish, it's slightly more distant in terms of vocab. The grammar is it's like identical. But yeah, because at first I was like, okay, I'll do Spanish because that'll be different enough. And then
It's
I got
unique to Spanish and Portuguese. They're very peripheral. So like Catalan, French, Italian, they all shared a lot of the same innovations. Like, it's comer in Spanish and Portuguese, but it's some variant of manjar in, those more central languages. So
exactly.
yeah, I totally understand.
That's why I was kind of interested. I was like, oh, Spanish is going to do it for me. And then I was like, no, it wasn't different enough. So I've been kind of searching. The point is, I've been searching for my
I love
next.
Portuguese
Portuguese
as a
is really
Romance
cool,
language. I
but
enjoy how it sounds, the nasal vowels and diphthongs, and
I
I
think
have
it's
a thing for some of the content. It's very unique,
mhm,
watching someone in Amazonas do something, or
right.
watching somebody in Angola or Mozambique. It's very interesting because at the end of the day, I kind of get bored of the same old. This is a modern urban city, and
Right.
the sort of the content is. At the end of the day, it's not super divergent, but watching someone in Mozambique hunt jungle rats for food is very different. And
It's very different.
um, I highly
Right.
recommend the channel Patria Minha if you're learning
Uh-huh.
Portuguese.
Okay.
He's an African gentleman who has some very unique content. But
Okay.
yeah, I think it's really cool. And what's the comparison been making that switch from these languages that do share a lot of grammar, that do share a lot of
Mhm.
vocab, to something like Czech, despite being Indo-European, is very different from the Western European languages, or something like
Mhm.
Hungarian, which is not Indo-European at all.
Mhm. So, in one sense, it's very refreshing for to have a lack of cognates because it's like in my mind after having kind of gone through the Romance languages, it's like, oh, does every language have gender? Does every language have a lot of similar vocab? And it's of course no. So this has been an attempt really for me to remind myself of how diverse linguistically the world is, even within certain continents. Of course, I mean, like Finno-Ugric, like that whole language group is very different than the Romance languages. But yeah, it's a bit jarring at first, not having really any words for free. It's kind of I can't complain because it's more or less what I'm looking for. But it makes it a lot harder to get your foot in the door. And the problem with these sort of smaller language, okay, smaller in a general sense, is that there's not that much content necessarily, at least beginner content. You have some textbooks, but they're of varying quality and different
You don't have
YouTubers.
that sort of CI
No,
to
which
native
is
content
exactly,
pipeline that you get with some of the other languages.
yeah. But interestingly, even though Italian's quite large, it has like little, I think, no CI, no true comprehensible input where it's very basic and not dumbed down. I shouldn't use that word, but very clear, very simple language where people are pointing to things or
But there is some simplified Italian out there. They're great and
maybe I
reiterative.
haven't looked for it. But
No, they
there's not
they
that.
they exist.
Okay,
I've
good.
looked at
That's
them.
good. That
Uh,
reassures me. But there's not as much as there should be, in my opinion. Czech, I got
oh
interested
yeah,
in, actually, for the reason I was browsing the comprehensible input wiki. I was like, if I want to learn another language, I want CI to be a big component of it because I was getting, I heard about dreaming Spanish. Even though when I was doing Spanish, I was like, dreaming Spanish, oh, but whatever. I'm just going to do things my way. But that sort of worked out because, I knew a couple of Romance languages. But now then I went back and I was like, I think there's something here. I think there's something to be said that if you can watch a video where there's all the words are unknowns, but you can communicate meaning just by gestures, just by tone of voice, by pictures. I think that's really incredible. And it's been interesting talking to people um, in the Refold community and other communities who have learned languages, who have gone all the way with languages like this, specifically for Thai, because there's, of course, lots of CI for Thai.
right. Because I think
But
this was what's his name, Dan Brown, the ALG guy, sort of.
yeah,
Yeah,
Marvin J. Brown. Yeah.
Marvin J. Brown. That's
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
I think Dan Brown is he an author? I think
Maybe. I
I
don't
grabbed
know.
the wrong name from the hat.
No, it's fine.
Um, yeah, Marvin J. Brown. You're right.
So I saw that on the comprehensible input wiki. It's a wiki, and there's a bunch of languages. And despite there being lots of languages listed, again, some people add kind of channels that aren't true CI, or if there is CI, it's of varying quality. But I saw that there was one for Czech, and I was like, oh, that's interesting. Czech has always kind of interested me. because it's Slavic, but it's Western Slavic, and it sounds kind of, to me, smoother, and it fits my sensibilities more, maybe. And so I watched some of those videos, but I was like, still, I don't know a single word. It's still too incomprehensible. So I'd gone like 2 days trying to cram these videos, and it didn't really work. Interesting. I even made Reddit posts of, oh, does anyone want to do this language exchange and stuff? And it's funny because months later, probably early May or even late April, so a couple people responded finally, and it's like, this is just after I got out of the check phase, but whatever. I decided to do one of these as an experiment. One of these guys, he was trying to practice his English more as speaking, because he's in class and probably high school or something. And yeah, I was helping him with the speaking. But we went on Minecraft and did some comprehensible input. And he showed me lots of vocab, lots of words, and it was very educational, but also very intensive. It was like I realized now that there's a hard limit on how much kind of input in new languages you can do in a day, because there's so much your brain is trying to process in terms of grammar structures, and even new words, they just don't stick as well as they should. So yeah, you really have to take it slow, and that's what I'm finding with Hungarian. So that's Czech, and I kind of moved on. But Hungarian too is interesting. I've really just started dabbling in it recently. I'm not even sure if I'll continue, but I don't know what to say about it. I think my hunch is that it's quite linguistically rich. It's cool to learn a language that's even more isolated, even less related to other languages around it. It kind of decreases the utility of it, but utility has never been a major motivator for me necessarily. I mean, I didn't have a reason to learn Italian.
It's
But yeah,
always fun to choose a language um, that people cannot read a page and get the gist.
yeah,
If you show an English speaker a very simple Dutch sentence or a very simple
mm,
French sentence, they're going to understand probably a decent amount.
totally.
Uh, Whereas if you show them something in, Indonesian or Swahili, they're not going to have that. And it's always a sort of a fun experience, sort of uh,
Mm,
I call it understanding Klingon,
yeah,
because it's sort of just, it's like you wouldn't, I don't know, it's a very fun feeling. And I
mm,
understand what you're talking about.
yeah. It does feel very alien in a good way, but recently, again, I've only been at it for maybe a week and a half, maybe two. Um, it's starting to feel less weird. It's starting to feel more like a language. And I think the benefit of Hungarian is that it seems to me, to my ear, it feels clearer than other languages. Where, like, if I listen to Cantonese, for instance, I really can't pick out much. Like something, not just the tones, but something about the combination of vowels and consonants just isn't super clear to my ear, because it's quite different than what I'm used to. But with Hungarian, it feels like there's a similar vowel consonant pattern with other languages that I'm familiar with, but it's just that the words themselves don't carry meaning for me yet, because they're so different.
I know what you're talking about. The word forms feel stickier. They feel like words,
Stickier,
whereas
yeah, exactly.
in some languages, the way their words are made up can feel like nonsense syllables, and it can be
Mhm.
hard to sort of get that scaffolding into your brain.
Totally,
It's all
totally.
very subjective, not scientific, but I think I know what you're talking about.
Yeah, yeah. Um,
How regular is Hungarian? So one thing I have noticed is that agglutinative languages tend to be fairly regular. They're not always, I think some languages throw that out the window. But uh, one of the cool things about learning a language like Turkish or something where there's a lot of regularity
mhm.
is that once you master it, you're good. You can apply that across all forms. And I'm not sure how Hungarian fits into that. I actually know surprisingly little about Hungarian.
Mhm. Well, so do I. I don't know much about Hungarian. Um, I I'm not totally sure. I think it's pretty regular. The what I have learned in terms of case endings and prefixes, affixes seem to be across the board pretty regular. I haven't seen well, again, I'm not familiar with what's regular and what would then be irregular, but it feels very logical, I have to say. There's lots of, okay, this long word is just this prefix plus this ending. Oh, and then it's made up of two words. It's very logical. But one thing, I guess the main intrigue for me with Hungarian is the etymology. You really get it's almost a similar feeling with Icelandic, where even though there's lots of actually Slavic cognates, and some Estonian Finnish cognates, I've ran into a couple, but I don't know much about those languages. It's still they're still pretty distant. The etymology feels very folkloric. It feels very unique. I like to use the example of how rainbow, in English and Romance languages, it's like an arc, something. It's some saint's arc, or it's some arc in the
Arco
sky.
Iris.
Yeah, exactly.
And bow is just like the native English for arch, essentially, right? Like a bow.
Exactly.
It's an arch.
Yeah, arch is the word in here. Sorry, I forgot it. But in Hungarian, it's like I think the etymology is that it has the word to suck in it, as in like a straw, to suck through a straw. And the idea is that the gods, when they descend to earth, or the gods use the rainbow as a straw to extract water from the earth. And it's like that's cool that there's like a story. There's more of a story behind the words. Etymologies really attracted me in English too. I think learning Italian gives you lots of it shows you how Latinate English can be, and it makes you sound fancier in English when really in reality it's just like laziness. Like for a long time I could not use the word ameliorate just because it was closer to the Italian migliorare, which is to get better. And I don't know. I feel like the Latinate words in English are more direct. They're more concise. And I like that. But also I don't like that they necessarily have a kind of lofty sound. But also, so what I'm trying to say is that learning the Romance languages made me realize how English was very Germanic in that sense.
It's interesting that you mention, speaking of Romance language, it causes you to use more Romance vocabulary. Because I think this is
Unconsciously.
actually, yeah, I think that there's something to it. I feel like there have been studies done that show that shared pools of vocab are just easier to grab at. If the word survive is in Spanish, English, and French, right? Survive, sobrevivir. And one interesting thing is the use of Spanish words in Filipino has actually gone up since English literacy and English ability has gone up, because it's very easy to Hispanicize a Latinate word in English, and bam, you've got the Spanish, which sort of flows better in Filipino. It sounds more natural than having an English loanword. And I've heard similar things about Maltese as well, with its sort of Italian words. So for some reason, we have like a shared pool of vocab. It's just easier when the words are the same or similar, I think, to grasp at.
Totally. But it's interesting. My point is that being completely on one side of, okay, I'm drenched in the Romance, you're immersed in the Romance languages, and then you go to English, which you're in my native language, which is a mix of a lot of things. And then you
English feels
see,
very Germanic outside of the vocab,
yeah,
I think. I think
yeah,
our phrasal verbs,
totally,
hanging prepositions like where you at, putting
yeah,
preposition at the end, which would be totally verboten in Spanish or something. I really feel like the Romance stuff is very surface level. Like it's mostly lexical. I feel like
yeah,
the
I
grammar is
agree.
very similar to like what you would expect from like a Nordic language, like Swedish
Totally.
or Norwegian or
Yeah.
Dutch. Um, because in those Germanic languages, we tend to have those phrasal or separable verbs, like get up, get out,
Yeah.
stand up.
Recently
And
with some people, sorry, go ahead.
oh, go ahead. No, they just tend to not be things in other languages.
Yeah.
Like Filipino, for example, prefers very specific words. There's a verb that specifically means to stare out a window. So in
Right.
English, you would say, "I'm going to stare out a window," but In Filipino, you can literally just say this word, dumulao, which means to look out a window. Like that's the whole word baked
Yeah.
into one. They tend to have very
Yeah.
specific words, whereas English, we have these sort of phrases, I think.
Yeah. I totally agree with that. And it's interesting how in essay writing, because I go to school for English literature, and in essays, usually phrasal verbs are kind of supposed to be avoided. It's not that there's any written rule about it, but they sound clunkier in an academic setting.
Yeah, it's like a
Um,
style guide.
yeah, exactly. But yeah, no, it's interesting because only recently, the more you spend time with other languages, the more you kind of get to better understand your own native language through contrast. Because if you're
They call that
monolingual,
metalinguistic awareness.
I like the word. Um, yeah, like I'd only recently kind of grasped how odd phrasal verbs are, and especially with people in the community. There's a user Looney Tunes, is Brazilian, and his English is quite good. And another user Scott and I were talking to him about phrasal verbs, and we found this blog of these weird phrasal verbs, and it was really registering for the first time. Like, man, English would be a pain in the ass to learn if I wasn't native, because a lot of things just don't make sense. Like one that I just thought of was keep out, as in like a warning on the signs. Like, I don't know, or hold on. I think that's a pretty classic. There's just so many, and yeah, like you said with prepositions, it's like it would be too difficult to assign meaning. It's like, okay, this is what this preposition means, and then you'd see it in a bunch of different contexts, and you're like, you know, but other languages have this. Japanese has lots of weird grammar things. I shouldn't talk too much about Japanese because I really am not that good at it, but there's a lot in Japanese that they're like kakeru is like used with it's a verb used with lots of different nouns, and it means different things depending on the situation. You would translate it as meaning different things in English, but in Japanese it represents one idea. So I don't know. There's so much to appreciate about language. That's why I like it so much.
Yeah. A lot of things that we unfortunately take for granted can be quite rare. I think cross-linguistically, English for sure has a lot. I'm sure with Hungarian, it's probably your first language. Well, I guess Icelandic doesn't have articles, but like, I don't think Hungarian
But
probably
they
has like
do.
a
They're
word
at
for
the end of words though.
Okay, so Hungarian does have them.
Yeah, sorry. I was talking about Icelandic there, but
Okay.
Hungarian definitely does have articles. Yeah.
Okay.
I think it's only one though,
Um,
if I'm not mistaken.
Usually languages will have the definite article and not have the indefinite article. That's sort of the hierarchy.
Mm-hmm.
It's like languages like I think like the Celtic languages, Arabic, they have a word for the, right? Like al.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and then eventually they also get an indefinite article. But some languages break the mold. I think Turkish has an indefinite article and doesn't have a definite article, but there's just a whole bunch. Filipino does not have gender pronouns at all, right?
Mm-hmm.
So like it's the same word for he and she,
Yeah.
which coming from English,
The same
you're
in
just sort of used to
Hungarian.
that. Yeah, and I think in like the 6 years that I've spoken Filipino,
Uh-huh.
I've only had one time where I was listening to a story and I was confused about the gender.
Yeah.
One time. It's very rare that it happens because there are other ways you can tell who is doing what to whom.
Totally.
But
I
yeah,
think
it makes for some. It's fun. It's always fun to sort of get a wider scope. And we talk about genders. Swahili has, for example, like 15 noun classes. So like how Romance languages have animate, or sorry, they have male, masculine, feminine, and sometimes neuter.
yeah.
Like Romanian. It has way more. Like noun classes can be quite out there. There's a famous book on noun classes in an Australian language called Fire, Women, and Other Dangerous Things. And that's one gender for them. It incorporates women, fire, and other dangerous things. And that's one noun class.
That's
So
great. Nice.
speakers divide up the world in various ways.
Yeah, that's what this is about, really. Language is a way to see the world, and I think that's why it's so liberating to learn another language to a high level. It's because you have a different way to express meaning and your place in the world too. But it's really, and on that topic, the Romance language, I've heard of people, and I would agree with this statement, that the Romance languages feel like extensions of one another, maybe with French kind of being an exception, in my mind.
Maybe Romanian, kind of
Yeah,
different too.
Romanian too. I'm sorry, I'm forgetting about Romanian. But like especially Spanish and Catalan, like I think they're, I mean, in the day to day, they're always mixed in. And granted, if the person you're talking to speaks both, then people will switch back and forth depending on the context and whatever. And they feel like an extension of one another, and it doesn't feel, nothing feels separate. But also, even though I don't speak super great Japanese or Icelandic necessarily, in my mind it's like it's difficult. I wouldn't say many people like divide up, okay, this is this language, this is that language. It's more or less just meaning, because especially when I'm speaking English, sometimes there'll be a phrase that comes to me in Italian and now French, and I'll be like, oh, I can't say that, but my brain figured out, oh, this is the best phrase to say in this situation. But then later, consciously, I have to be like, oh, wait, I'm in this language, I'm not allowed to use that. So there's that too.
And then actually, I read something on the front page of the linguistics subreddit recently. We've got one pool of vocab, and it's a shared pool, and the brain has to consciously deselect all of the vocab that's not appropriate for a specific situation.
Interesting.
Notice I said situation, not language, because there are some situations like Welsh or Filipino or Spanglish, in like Miami or something, where there tend to be highly bilingual speakers, where it is appropriate for them to randomly use a Spanish word in an English sentence, or vice versa. And apparently it's a skill. The gist that I got from that was that we're really good at doing it for our L1, and for our L2s, it's shaky. It's harder to not pull the wrong word with an L2.
Yeah, I can see that.
Yeah. So it's very interesting with Catalan. I feel like I definitely feel like it's closer in a lot of ways to like the languages northeast of Spain. I feel like it very smoothly transitions into like Gascon and Occitan and stuff like that. And I've actually heard that written Catalan and written French are very mutually intelligible. I've heard that somebody could probably do quite fine working through like a Catalan text if they're say from they're from France. I don't know how true that is, but I'd say it's pretty
true. The spelling looks again, I really haven't almost read anything in Catalan. That's this experiment, but
there's a lot to read in Catalan.
There is.
I almost got bitten by the Catalan bug, and there's so much to read. I know you're avoiding it because you want to focus on the spoken language, but like they've got like
I'm excited
for it, and like there's so much like literature in Catalan for like a language of 6 million people, maybe.
It's is it 9 million? It's actually quite large.
Okay, yeah, there's just a lot in Catalan.
Yeah, they do use X, which is quite weird. So I don't know how a French speaker would react to that, but generally the cognates that are usually across, that you'd see, the related words across Romance languages tend to be closer to French spelling. So that's why they're probably more easily.
Right, it's sort of like in Portuguese and Spanish, you've got manzana, manzana, and then I guess Catalan is one of the palm languages that uses some sort of palm word, and eat, right, manja or whatever in Italian, and Catalan and French. So very interesting. All right, now we are nearing the end of the hour that we have. Before we go, what is your sort of sage advice, your words of wisdom? What is the takeaway you would like the listeners to have?
Language related, language learning related, in what sense?
Just a takeaway. What's your sort of words of wisdom? You've gone from being totally isolated, doing all Italian all the time, to volunteering. You've done some, you're a mod now on the Refold community. You're quite active on voice chat. It could be related to not isolating yourself. It can be related to getting out of your comfort zone and not going down the route of just learning all of the related languages. Any sort of advice you'd like for the listeners to take away?
So I would definitely say the not be isolated part. Language is something that is, first of all, spoken and of course written too, but it's a method of communication. It's a means to an end. It can be the object of study, and us interested in language. Of course, it's very interesting in and of itself, but it's also important to remember that there's a whole population that speaks it, and you should consider. This is something I'm telling myself now, as I'm trying to find my next language, my next major language that I want to settle down with. That you should really consider how much you think you're like the culture. It's hard to know before you learn the language, but would you want to integrate into that culture? Would you want to be a part of that linguistic sphere? I think these are important questions rather to ask yourself before you decide, okay, this is going to be my life for the next couple of years. I'm just going to start immersing. Luckily, it worked out with Italian. Like, I didn't really have any specific goals, and I almost dropped it multiple times, but I'm like, I might as well keep going. And I'm very glad I did, because it culminated in something really great for me. And I got lucky. Had I chosen another language, maybe I would have regretted it. And I don't want anyone to regret learning a language. I've heard of people regretting learning Japanese, like Matt, but then they come to terms with it. So it's just better to avoid this step altogether, in my opinion, and to kind of remind yourself, okay, like, I'm putting all this time and effort in. Is it worth it? Is this something I really want to have for me for the rest of my life? These are important reflections, in my opinion. So, yeah.
All right. And Alex, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for everything you do for the community, for helping out with the Italian community, the Italian deck. Yeah. And I'll see you around.
Yeah, have a good day.
I want to thank you for listening to this episode of the Refold Podcast. If you're watching the live premiere, you're in luck. Right as it ends, we have an after party over on the Refold Central Discord server. Come join us by using refold.link/join and chat about the episode. If you enjoyed the podcast and would like to hear more, you can find older episodes to listen to on YouTube and Spotify. Let us know what you thought about the video by liking and leaving a comment below. Do you have suggestions for upcoming visitors or requests for particular topics? Please feel free to reach out to me on Discord at GeorgePig #5413 or via email at clayton@refold.la. Thank you all for watching and or listening, and I'll see you next week.